Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is coming under fire for shunning democracy. Her long-promised Sovereignty Act is supposed to shield the province from federal laws, but it also contains sweeping new powers for her cabinet, including the power to change provincial laws without going through the legislature. So will the federal government step in? Dominic, LeBlanc is the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. Minister, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with the Prime Minister's comments today. He said he isn't ruling anything out when it comes to the Sovereignty Act, but he says he's not looking to pick a fight. Not ruling anything out, does that mean you will consider using federal disallowance to veto this piece of legislation?
I think that would obviously be an extreme gesture on our part. We're certainly a very long way away from even thinking about that kind of thing. I mean, there's, to be technical about it, David, there's nothing to disallow. Like, this is a bill that was introduced. It has yet to be debated, may be amended, then passed. Then there may or may not be some challenges to it. We've noted just in 24 hours, less than 24 hours, a number of voices in Alberta, including the Calgary Chamber of Commerce earlier today, expressing concerns about this bill. So let's see it work its way through the legislative process in Alberta, and at the right moment, we'll decide if we want to do anything about it. But we think Albertans need to be heard on this particular bill right now.
But on its face, you have a piece of legislation that allows the province to ignore federal law, compel a string of provincial agencies to essentially do the same. I mean, when you look at its intention, I mean, how is that acceptable in the Canadian system of government?
It's probably unprecedented in what it pretends to be able to do. This is some kind of legislation that we haven't seen in provincial legislatures before, but provincial governments introduce bills in their legislatures all the time.
Not like this, though. We've never seen anything like this before.
Right, so it doesn't mean we have to rush around to some judgment. We don't have to get ahead of our skis on this. Let's hear the voices in Alberta. Let's see ultimately what the legislature of Alberta decides to do with this. Even if it were passed, let's say, as presented, it sort of sits on a shelf until some minister apparently comes into the legislature with a resolution on a particular federal initiative. It all feels very hypothetical. We think Albertans are interested in the Government of Canada working collaboratively with their government on real issues. We signed a childcare agreement, which was terrific in terms of helping families in Alberta reduce the significant cost of childcare. We're working with them around immigration and labor force shortages. We want to do something significant in terms of the fight against climate change with Albertans and with the provincial government. I had the minister, the deputy premier, and the minister of infrastructure in our part of the country. He was in Bucktouche and Moncton, New Brunswick with me for a couple of days to talk about infrastructure programming. So we're really focusing on those kind of things, and we'll let the legislature of Alberta do what it wants to do and then decide if we want to do anything on our side.
Right, you're focusing on those things, but Danielle Smith has already said she wants her ministers to look at various federal policies and see if there are things that conflict with what they consider to be the constitutional rights of the province. And it should be pointed out, this is something politicians would decide, not a court, or even if it inflicts harm.
And that's unusual too.
Right, exactly.
That normally the constitutionality of a particular measure is not left to a legislature to determine. It's properly left to a court of competent jurisdiction. In this case, it would be the Superior or the King's Bench of Alberta, right, and the Court of Appeal and so on. So that process appears to have been a bit sideswiped, but it doesn't mean that some Albertans won't decide perhaps to go to, at some future point, a court to discuss this bill.
But the plain reading of it, and if you listen to what Premier Smith has said, her opposition to the gun legislation and the gun regulations your government is bringing in, she's suggested she wants a resolution under the powers of this act for their legislature to deal with in the spring. I mean, you have a framework now being laid in front of the legislature of Alberta where they could declare your gun laws unconstitutional and then compel police in Edmonton, police in Calgary, not to enforce your gun laws. I mean, how do you react to the notion that this seems to be the path that she's headed towards?
So again, you're using a hypothetical, but one
she says she wants to deal with this.
And you're right. We've taken note of that in her leadership campaign. Unfortunately, deciding to enforce the Criminal Code of Canada is not an optional thing. The police forces and the prosecutors of the province of Alberta have a constitutional obligation to enforce the Criminal Code of Canada as it properly applies in their province or territory. They know that. Some of this is political posturing, perhaps. The idea that we're sort of going to have a criminal code free zone in Alberta doesn't really make a lot of sense. It doesn't speak, frankly, David, to the real issues of Albertans, the concern of the business community today. I mean, if we want to attract investment, if we want to attract new workers and deal with some of the real challenges around labor force in terms of what it means for the economic growth potential of Alberta, this isn't constructive. The Alberta economy is important to the economy of the whole country. And in the part of the country I represent in the House of Commons that you know well, many families in Atlantic Canada and across the country have benefited from a prosperous and growing economy in Western Canada, including in Alberta. And we think it's important to focus on those real issues and, frankly, let this kind of a discussion take place in the legislature of Alberta.
But it becomes a real issue if once it moves outside the discussion in the legislature of Alberta. I mean, she has made it clear, the Premier, that she does not support your gun laws. She's already talked about not having the RCMP, who are there as contract police, enforce this. This was even before this legislation was contemplated. So what would you expect them to do? You said prosecutors and police have to enforce the criminal code, but if they declare your gun laws unconstitutional by their standards and tell the police service of Calgary not to enforce it, what does the Chief of Police of Calgary do in that circumstance?
Yeah, so again, interesting theoretical question for a law faculty.
I don't know how theoretical this is,
Well, you're three hypotheticals. First of all, you're assuming the legislation will be adopted as is. Then you're assuming that some minister will come in with that particular resolution and get that adopted.
It's based on the words of the Premier, though. This is not me making this up out of whole
but it wouldn't
cloth.
be the first time a Premier across the country said something in terms of political posturing that didn't turn out to be as simple as people thought. We also thought there was going to be stuff in terms of anti-vax mandates and so on in the legislation. That apparently was left out. So we're not going to overreact to what is, in our view, an issue that Albertans can debate and decide themselves. If we ever got to a very bizarre hypothetical that the legislature of Alberta, not within their competent authority, would decide that some federal measure was unconstitutional, that is properly in the hands of the court process. The courts have that jurisdiction under our Constitution. The legislation's also silent, you would have noticed, in terms of what are the remedies if the police chief of Alberta decided to properly apply the Constitution and enforce the criminal code. If the police chief of Calgary, were to decide to do that, the legislation, as we understand it, would be silent in terms of a remedy. What would they do to the police chief of that particular jurisdiction? So there are so many hypotheticals and what-ifs. We're going to focus on the real work that people expect us to do and see ultimately how the government of Alberta might use this legislation should it be adopted. And then if we have to take our responsibilities as a national government, of course we would do so.
You're all remarkably calm about an unprecedented challenge to federal authority inside the fourth largest province in Canada.
You would expect us to be calm. What's the opposite? Would be agitated and... Of course we're going to be calm.
Well, I mean, you've taken positions standing up for fundamental rights when the notwithstanding clause was used in Ontario, for example, in the recent labor disputes. I mean, these are fundamental challenges to basic rights. This seems like a fundamental challenge. Are you just trying not to engage so as to give oxygen to her anti-Ottawa cause in the run-up to the election and maybe have Rachel Notley win this fight for you in a few months?
Well, we've always said we're going to stand up for the fundamental charter rights of Canadians. As we did with respect to the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause in a labor dispute. This is the government of Alberta introducing at first reading, the most preliminary stage in a legislative process, a bill which we've noted a number of constitutional experts have said may have some dubious underpinnings.
Right.
So let's let the process play out. They're not in a position to invoke this bill next week or before Christmas. Let's let the legislative process of Alberta run its course. But make no mistake about it, we will properly exercise federal jurisdiction, respecting their sovereign jurisdiction within their division of powers. But we're not going to evacuate federal jurisdiction and responsibility in the face of some legislation that may not have significant constitutional underpinning.
So just a final point before we let you go. I mean, what's the trigger point where you do start to be concerned by this? Is it when a resolution comes before the Alberta legislature to exercise these powers? Is that when you start to be a little bit more concerned than you are right now at this stage in the process?
Well, that would be a real scenario. That's not a hypothetical scenario that'll occupy a law faculty seminar next week. right? That would be the faculty club at some university will be very exercised.
It's more serious than that, though, isn't it?
Well, it will be if the legislation is adopted and if they start to use it in some of the ways you suggested. That would be serious. And then we would obviously be absolutely prepared to assume our responsibilities as a national government within our own jurisdiction. We would ask the provinces respect that the way we will respect their sovereignty within their own provincial jurisdiction. That's how our federation works, and that's perhaps why I'm not panicked or agitated or it may be frustrating for you, but I'm very serene about all this.
No, it's not frustrating, and we appreciate you coming to, Minister LeBlanc.
I'm glad to be here.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's Minister LeBlanc's reaction. Alberta's Sovereignty Act is, of course, getting lots of attention on Parliament Hill from both sides of the aisle. Have a listen to this.
I'm not going to take anything off the table, but I'm also not looking for a fight. We want to continue to be there to deliver for Albertans. There's going to be things that we agree with that government on. There's going to be things we disagree with them on.
I think that what we see in Alberta is different proposals for responding to the tensions that have been created by this Prime Minister. There's a lot of very significant frustration, not just in Alberta, but I think especially in Alberta, about the impact that federal decisions have had on our energy sector, on the ability of people to provide for themselves and their families.
And at a time when people are worried about getting care, you've got a premier that's so disconnected from reality that they're putting forward a bill that has nothing to do with the problems of the day.
If we do respect the jurisdiction of the Constitution, you can achieve great things in this country, and we have seen that in Quebec. We will see what will happen in other provinces.
If she does succeed and make a country out of Alberta, I will be a bit jealous, but I will say good for you.
Okay, that's a view on Parliament Hill. Meanwhile, this is how things sounded inside the Alberta legislature today.
Granting herself the ability to write laws in secret, behind closed doors, no reviews, no checks, no balances, just an unprecedented abuse of authority. To the Premier, why is her first act an unconstitutional, anti-democratic attack on the democratic rights of Alberta?
The Honourable the Premier! No, it does not. It's very clear, and I suppose if the opposition had stayed to actually read the bill when it was presented yesterday, I would have expected they might have read it in the meantime. They would have seen that every decision that is going to be made has to first get the validation from this Assembly. Our people want to make sure that we stand up to Ottawa, and that's exactly what we're going to do with the Sovereignty Act.
Okay, we've asked for an interview with Premier Danielle Smith as well as Alberta Justice Minister Tyler Shandro. We did not receive a response. That invitation is still open, folks, if you're watching, but we have reached Rachel Notley, who is a leader of Alberta's NDP. She is in Edmonton. Ms. Notley, thank you so much for joining us. I don't know how much you heard of Dominic LeBlanc on the show a little while ago, but he says at this point the federal government is watching this very calmly, and the concerns at this point in the process are a lot of hypotheticals and what-ifs. What do you make of the federal response to the Sovereignty Act?
Well, you know, I'm not really going to get too involved in the federal response because as leader of the official opposition, I'm focused on looking at what's right in front of me, and that is a provincial government that is embarking on an unprecedented effort to destabilize our economy, to drive investment out of the province, and then on top of it, to make a historic power grab for themselves to operate outside of the legislature. That last clip you played of the Premier has been completely discredited. Her own Deputy Minister of Justice, the public servant, has articulated that what she described there was not accurate, that the bill does in fact give them the ability to pass a fairly benign and generic resolution and then go behind closed doors and start rewriting legislation outside of the purview of the Assembly, which is a profound trampling of democratic rights in Alberta, and also the kind of thing that is going to drive investment away from the province of Alberta at the worst time possible.
Okay, there's a lot there. I want to walk through it a little bit, bit by bit. You mentioned that the Deputy Minister of Justice confirmed this. That was the explanation given to journalists in a technical briefing yesterday. I understand the New Democrats had a briefing today, correct? And is that where you got that explanation from the Deputy Minister of Justice?
That is absolutely correct. We got it confirmed by the Deputy Minister of Justice. And to be clear, we're capable of reading legislation as well. The Premier and her Justice Minister are being either incredibly, worryingly obtuse or intentionally misleading. But we've read it. We can see what it says. And the Deputy Minister of Justice confirmed that the way she characterized it in the clip we played is simply not accurate.
Okay, so because I've tried to get some clarity on this myself from, oh, we got a weird echo happening all of a sudden. I tried to get some clarity on this myself from Alberta in terms of the powers cabinet gets under this. It's triggered by a resolution that is voted on by the legislature. So there is an element that does go to the Parliament of Alberta to deal with this. What has been unclear, and there was a clarification attempt from the Alberta government today saying that the amendments would be spelled out in the resolution. What I understand.
That's not laid out. Yeah, that's not what the Act says.
Right, that is not what the Act says. So what I'm trying to figure out is that would the resolutions be broad, directional advice for Cabinet as opposed to explicit amendments to legislation? Because Cabinet is not a legislative body, and this essentially allows Cabinet to change the law without ever coming back to the legislature. Is that your understanding of where things stand 24 hours later?
That is absolutely correct. And so the Act says what it says, and we can only go by what the law says. And in the Act, there are no specifications in terms of the level of detail that has to come to the legislature, not to mention that the process for debating a motion is significantly less rigorous than the process for passing a piece of legislation. But either way, what you described is accurate. And even above and beyond, this legislative and parliamentary discussion, what we are hearing from investors inside and outside of Alberta already, from business leaders in Calgary, is that the more they see of this, the more they hear of this, the more inclined they are to withhold their investment dollars because they have no idea what kind of wackiness is going on in the province of Alberta right now. They need predictability. And this Act, even if there wasn't this democratic or anti-democratic power grab, this Act renders a whole bunch of laws in question. And you don't attract investment when that's what you're doing.
I know you say you don't want to get too much into the federal response, but there have been calls for the federal government to use the power of disallowance under the Constitution to disallow a provincial law based on the unprecedented nature and the far-reaching nature of what this piece of legislation purports to do. Where do you stand on that? Should the Prime Minister get involved directly and use the power of disallowance to deal with the Sovereignty Act?
Well, I certainly don't want to see something like that. That would be a horrifyingly embarrassing and controversial and conflict-ridden position for everyone to be put in. The last time that happened was in the 30s in Alberta with Bill Aberhart when he tried to print money. And I have to think that our government or some folks within that government, if not the Premier, some of the folks around her are going to engage in a little bit of sober second thought and stop with this sort of crazy politicking and try to restore some stability to this province's government between now and the next election. This is bad news for our efforts at economic recovery. And I have to think that there are at least a few folks there who are questioning the wisdom of this move. And certainly our view is that we're going to push them to make better decisions. That's where my focus is right now.
Do you think this is an attempt, at least in part by Premier Smith, to draw the Prime Minister, to draw the federal Liberals more into Alberta politics in the run-up to the election, to sort of create an Alberta versus Ottawa dynamic for the campaign?
I don't know. It's an old story. Excuse me. In Alberta politics, when governments are doing a bad job in their own backyard, they start shooting at people elsewhere. And that doesn't mean that there aren't important issues that we have to negotiate and take the federal government to task on, but there are appropriate ways to do that. And this is not that. In the meantime, we're missing affordability issues and we're missing healthcare.
Okay, and Premier Kenny, or former Premier Kenny, excuse me, He resigned yesterday. There were many days he could have picked to do his resignation, but he picked the day that the Sovereignty Act was tabled. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that particular timing as to why he did that. If you need to grab a glass of water, I can keep giving people some explanation on what's going on. Premier Kenney had said previously that he was going to vote against the Sovereignty Act. He called it essentially constitutional craziness. He felt it would cause enormous problems. And, you know, despite the fact that Premier Kenney was the immediate predecessor to Danielle Smith as the head of the United Conservative Party, he is a big believer in the federal division of powers and in the integrity of institutions, and he felt the Sovereignty Act was an assault on that. So he had signaled that he was going to vote against this, but then shortly after Danielle Smith and everybody rolled out their rationale behind the Sovereignty Act within a United Canada, I should say, that was added to the title, and explained what they were intending to do, Jason Kenney issued a statement on Twitter announcing that he was resigning as an MLA for his riding in Calgary, and that he was going to, he lamented what was happening in terms of respect for institutions in political conversations from both the extreme left, as he says it, and the extreme right, the left trying to cancel history and institutions, the right now spiraling into conspiracy and populism, and that these were the concerns that he had. So clearly a significant shift in the United Conservative Party's approach from the views of Jason Kenney and his position on things to where we are with Danielle Smith right now, and he resigned as an MLA rather than vote against this legislation as he had signaled in the past. So, Rachel Notley, I think you've been able to get a drink. And it's like, I wonder what you, not my monologue, but what Jason Kenney did yesterday and the timing of when he did it and why he did it.
Well, you know, I think he was raising a very legitimate concern. Not only Jason Kenney, but many people who are now sitting in that cabinet have identified what was a legitimate concern, that this act is going to create chaos and instability, and it was going to undermine economic security. And so Jason Kenney, to his credit, at least, acted on what he had said. We now have a number of members of cabinet who are standing by a very contradictory position to where they were publicly a few weeks ago. That's why we're going to be calling on a lot of key stakeholders in Alberta to reach out to those folks as well in an effort to get this government to back down on, as I've said, what is such an incredibly destabilizing piece of legislation that is very damaging to what is most important to Albertans, which is economic recovery.
I wonder if you can indulge me for one last question. You were a former premier. What do you think Danielle Smith would have said on our radio show if you had tried to pass legislation that gave your cabinet these powers?
Well, I'm not going to put myself into the head of a shock jock commentator on a right-wing radio show, but suffice to say, periodically she tries to present herself as someone who cares about the grassroots, and this is a deeply, deeply undemocratic move. And honestly, I don't know that there's a piece of legislation that we've ever seen in the province's history that has the potential to be as undemocratic as this one. It's not just pulling power away from the legislature on one issue. It has the potential to pull power away from the legislature on a whole range of issues. And that goes against everything she claimed to be running on. And none of this is remotely going to be connected to any kind of actual strategic, successful, thoughtful effort to secure and improve the rights of Albertans in relation to the federal government or in relation to their role as part of Canada.
Okay, Rachel Notley, thank you so much. That's Rachel Notley, the leader of the Alberta NDP.